The water swallowed her whole before she even had time to scream. And Nora Owens knew with terrible certainty that she was about to die in the Arkansas River on what should have been an ordinary April morning in 1878. She had been crossing at the shallow ford, the same crossing she had used dozens of times before, but the spring rains had transformed the usually placid river into a raging torrent. The wagon wheel had caught on a submerged rock, and before she could steady herself, the entire conveyance tipped sideways, throwing her into the churning brown water. Her heavy skirts immediately became waterlogged anchors, dragging her down despite her frantic attempts to keep her head above the surface. The current was merciless, spinning her like a rag doll, slamming her against rocks and debris carried downstream by the flood. She gasped for air and got a mouthful of muddy water instead, choking and flailing as the river carried her away from the overturned wagon, away from the shore, away from any hope of survival. Her lungs burned. Her vision blurred. She tried to grab onto a passing tree branch, but her frozen fingers could not maintain their grip, and the river tore her away once more. This was it, she thought with a strange calm that settled over her panic. This was how Nora Owens would meet her end, drowned in a river gone wild, just 3 miles from Fort Smith, where she had been heading to sell her late father's collection of leather goods. Then something looped around her waist with surprising gentleness, despite the violence of the water around her. A rope. She felt it tighten, felt herself being pulled against the current with steady, determined strength. Her head broke the surface and she gulped air, coughing and sputtering, still being dragged by the river but now being pulled toward the shore as well. The rope burned against her ribs through the wet fabric of her dress, but she had never felt anything more wonderful in her entire 22 years of life. Strong hands grabbed her arms, hauling her up onto the muddy bank. She collapsed onto solid ground, vomiting river water and gasping, her entire body shaking from cold and shock. Someone was speaking to her, a man's voice, deep and concerned, but she could not make out the words over the roaring in her ears and the violent coughing that racked her body. "Easy now, easy," the voice said, and this time she heard it clearly. A hand pressed against her back, steadying her as she coughed up more water. "You are safe now. Just breathe. That is it, just breathe." When she finally managed to look up, she found herself staring into the most striking pair of gray eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to a man crouched beside her, his dark hair plastered to his forehead from the spray of the river, his face etched with concern. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features and a day's worth of stubble on his jaw. A cowboy, she realized, taking in his worn leather vest, the coiled rope still clutched in one hand, the horse standing nearby with reins dangling. "Thank you," she managed to croak, her throat raw from the water she had swallowed. "You saved my life." "Anyone would have done the same," he said, though his expression suggested he was not entirely certain that was true. "Can you stand? We need to get you warm and dry before you catch your death of cold." Her legs felt like water themselves when she tried to rise, and she would have fallen if he had not caught her, his arms sliding around her waist to support her weight. She leaned against him, having no other choice, feeling the solid warmth of his body through their wet clothes. "My wagon," she said, looking back at the river. The conveyance was nowhere to be seen, already carried downstream or sunk beneath the muddy water. "All my father's goods were in that wagon, everything." "Better the wagon than you," the cowboy said firmly. "Come on. My horse can carry us both to Fort Smith. You need a doctor." "I do not need a doctor," she protested, though her violent shivering undermined her words. "I just need to dry out." "You nearly drowned," he pointed out, already guiding her toward his horse, a sturdy roan gelding that eyed them both with patient indifference. "Humor me." She was too exhausted and too cold to argue further. He lifted her onto the horse with surprising ease, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. She found herself enclosed in the circle of his embrace, her back pressed against his chest, and under any other circumstances she would have been mortified by the impropriety. But these were not ordinary circumstances, and she was too grateful to be alive to worry about propriety. "I am Nora Owens," she said as the horse started walking at a steady pace toward the town visible in the distance. "From the Owens homestead about 15 miles south of here." "Griffin Dalton," he replied. "I work at the Morrison Ranch about 8 miles west. I was heading into Fort Smith for supplies when I saw your wagon go over." "I am in your debt, Mr. Dalton." "Griffin," he corrected, "and you owe me nothing. I am just glad I was close enough to reach you in time." His arm tightened slightly around her waist, a gesture that felt protective rather than forward. "That was some current. You are lucky you did not get your head staved in on the rocks." She shuddered, remembering the feeling of tumbling helplessly through the water, the impacts against her body that would surely leave bruises. "I thought I was going to die," she admitted quietly. "I truly thought that was the end." "But it was not," Griffin said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even though she could not see his face. "You are alive, Nora Owens, and that is what matters." They rode in silence for a while, the horse's steady gait gradually bringing them closer to Fort Smith. The town had grown considerably in recent years, becoming a hub for travelers heading west and a center of commerce for the surrounding farms and ranches. Nora had been there many times before, selling her father's leather work at the general store and the saddlery. Her father, God rest his soul, had been one of the finest leather workers in the territory, and his death 3 months ago had left her with a house full of finished goods and no way to support herself, except to sell them. "You said your father's goods were in the wagon," Griffin said, as though reading her thoughts. "Was he a merchant, a leather worker?" Nora replied. "He made saddles, bridles, belts, holsters. Beautiful work, all of it. I was bringing the last of his inventory to sell in Fort Smith." She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had done enough crying in the past 3 months. Now it is all gone. "I am sorry," Griffin said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice made the tears harder to hold back. "Losing a father is hard enough without losing his legacy as well. He taught me the trade," Nora said, surprised to find herself talking so freely to this stranger who had saved her life. "Every technique, every stitch. I can make anything he could make, but without materials or tools, that knowledge does me little good. The money from selling his remaining work was supposed to keep me fed and housed while I built up my own business." "There are other ways to make a living," Griffin offered, though he did not sound particularly convinced. "Not many for a woman alone," Nora said bluntly. "I could marry, I suppose, but I have no interest in becoming some man's property just to keep a roof over my head. I could teach, but the school in Fort Smith already has a teacher. I could take in sewing or laundry, but that barely pays enough to survive." She shook her head. "My father's leather work was my best chance at independence, and now it is at the bottom of the Arkansas River." Griffin was quiet for a moment, and Nora immediately regretted her outburst. Here was a man who had just saved her life, and she was burdening him with her problems. "Forgive me," she said quickly. "I should not be complaining to you about my troubles. You have already done more than enough for me." "Do not apologize," Griffin said. "You have every right to be upset. You nearly died and lost everything you own in the span of a few minutes. I think you are entitled to complain." They were entering Fort Smith now, the horses' hooves clopping on the wooden boards of the main street. People turned to stare at them, at the bedraggled woman in Griffin's arms and their soaking wet clothes. Nora saw Mrs. Henderson, the postmaster's wife, whisper something to her companion, and her cheeks burned despite the chill that still gripped her body. "The doctor's office is just ahead," Griffin said, ignoring the stares. "Then we will get you to the boarding house so you can get into dry clothes." "I cannot afford the boarding house," Nora admitted, her humiliation complete. "I have no money. It was all in my reticule, which was in the wagon." Griffin made a sound that might have been frustration or sympathy or both. "Then you will stay there as my guest," he said firmly. "No arguments. You can pay me back when you are on your feet again." "I cannot accept such charity," Nora protested, even as her body screamed for warmth and rest. "It is not charity," Griffin said, bringing the horse to a stop in front of a building with a painted sign that read Dr. Samuel Morris, physician. "It is common decency. You would do the same for me if our situations were reversed. Would she?" Nora wanted to think she would, but the truth was that she had no money to spare for strangers, no matter how grateful she might be. Still, she was in no position to refuse his help, and pride would not keep her warm or fed. Griffin dismounted and helped her down, his hands careful on her waist. Her legs were steadier now, though she still felt weak and shaky. He kept a hand on her elbow as he guided her into the doctor's office, a clean, well-lit room that smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Dr. Morris was a gray-haired man in his 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. He took one look at Nora's bedraggled state and immediately ushered her into the examination room, calling for his wife to bring blankets and hot tea. Griffin remained in the waiting area, and Nora felt oddly bereft without his steady presence beside her. The examination was thorough but mercifully quick. Dr. Morris pronounced her bruised but unbroken, with no signs of pneumonia or other complications from her near drowning. He instructed her to rest, stay warm, and return if she developed a fever or persistent cough. His wife, a plump woman with a motherly air, insisted on giving Nora a clean, dry dress to replace her ruined one, refusing to accept payment. When Nora emerged from the examination room wearing the borrowed dress, a simple brown calico that was a bit too large for her frame, Griffin stood immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked, his gray eyes searching her face. "Dr. Morris says I will be fine," Nora assured him. "Just bruised and tired. Good." The relief in his voice was unmistakable. "Then let us get you to the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher, who ran the boarding house, was a bustling woman in her 40s who asked no questions when Griffin explained that Nora needed a room, and that he would be covering the cost. She simply led Nora upstairs to a small but clean room with a proper bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. "I will have some supper sent up," Mrs. Fletcher said. "You look like you could use a good meal and a long sleep." When she was gone, Nora turned to Griffin, who had followed them upstairs and now stood in the doorway, looking oddly reluctant to leave. "Thank you," she said, trying to put all her gratitude into those two simple words. "For everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Griffin said. "I am just glad I was there when you needed help." He hesitated, then added, "I will be staying in town overnight. I have business at the feed store and the bank tomorrow morning. If you need anything, I am in room 4, just down the hall." "You are staying here as well." The thought brought her more comfort than it should have. "It is the only decent boarding house in Fort Smith," Griffin said with a slight smile. "And Mrs. Fletcher makes the best biscuits in the territory. I stay here whenever I come to town for supplies." "Then I will see you at breakfast, perhaps," Nora said, suddenly feeling shy. "You will," Griffin promised. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and charming, then turned and walked down the hall to his own room. Nora closed the door and leaned against it, her legs finally giving out. She sank to the floor, her borrowed dress pooling around her, and let the tears come at last. She cried for her father, for the lost wagon and its precious cargo, for the future she had been planning that now seemed impossible. But she also cried from relief, from the overwhelming gratitude of being alive, of having been saved by a stranger with kind eyes and strong hands. When Mrs. Fletcher knocked to deliver supper, a hearty stew with fresh bread and butter, Nora had composed herself. She ate every bite, suddenly ravenous, then crawled into the bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of voices in the street below. For a moment she could not remember where she was, and then the memories of the previous day came flooding back. The river, the drowning, Griffin Dalton and his rope and his kindness. Her body ached all over, a reminder of her tumble through the rapids, but she felt better than she had any right to feel. She washed her face at the washstand, braided her dark hair as best she could without a proper mirror, and headed downstairs to the dining room. Griffin was already there, seated at one of the long tables with a plate of eggs, bacon, and Mrs. Fletcher's famous biscuits. He looked up when she entered and smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his entire face. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" "Sore," Nora admitted, sitting down across from him, "but alive, thanks to you." Mrs. Fletcher appeared with a plate for Nora, piled just as high as Griffin's, and a cup of strong coffee. "You eat up, dear," she said kindly. "You need your strength after what you have been through." Nora ate, surprised by how hungry she was despite the large supper the night before. Griffin ate as well, and they shared a comfortable silence that felt natural rather than awkward. There were a few other guests at the boarding house, cattle buyers and traveling salesmen, but they paid little attention to Nora and Griffin. "What are your plans now?" Griffin asked when they had both finished eating. "Will you return to your homestead?" Nora had been thinking about that very question for most of the night during the brief periods when she had woken. "I do not know," she said honestly. "The homestead was my father's, and without him, it feels more like a burden than a home. But I have nowhere else to go, and no money to go anywhere even if I did." Griffin was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. Then he said, "The Morrison Ranch is always looking for help. We have a bunkhouse cook, but Mrs. Morrison has been wanting someone to help with the household work and the garden. It is not glamorous work, but it pays decent wages and includes room and board." "Are you offering me a job?" Nora asked, hardly daring to hope. "I am suggesting you apply for one," Griffin corrected. "I cannot hire you myself, but I can put in a good word with Mrs. Morrison. She is a fair woman, and she would appreciate having another woman on the ranch. Her husband died 2 years ago, and she has been running the place with her son and the hired hands ever since." It was not what Nora had planned for her life. She had wanted to be a leather worker, an independent businesswoman carrying on her father's legacy. But that dream was at the bottom of the Arkansas River, and she needed to be practical. Working as a household helper was honest work, and it would give her time to figure out her next steps. "I would be grateful for the introduction," Nora said. "When do you think I might meet Mrs. Morrison?" "I am heading back to the ranch this afternoon," Griffin said. "You could come with me if you are feeling well enough. Mrs. Morrison is usually in a good mood in the evenings, and we could talk to her then." "This afternoon?" Nora felt a flutter of nervousness. Things were moving so fast, but then again, she could not afford to stay at the boarding house for long, even with Griffin's generosity. "Unless you would rather rest another day," Griffin offered. I understand if you need more time to recover. No, Nora decided. I will come with you this afternoon. The sooner I can start earning my own keep, the better. They spent the morning in Fort Smith, Griffin conducting his business while Nora wandered the main street, looking at the shops with empty pockets and a heavy heart. She stopped by the river, standing at a safe distance from the water that had nearly killed her, and watched the muddy current rush past. Somewhere downstream, her father's beautiful leather goods were ruined or lost forever. It felt like losing him all over again. Nora. Griffin's voice came from behind her, gentle and questioning. Are you ready to go? She turned to him, forcing a smile. Yes, I am ready. The ride to the Morrison Ranch took just under 2 hours. Nora sat in front of Griffin on his roan gelding, more comfortable with the arrangement than she had been the day before, though still acutely aware of his presence. They talked as they rode, small conversations about the weather and the land and the ranching life. Griffin told her about the Morrison Ranch, how it ran about 200 head of cattle and supplied beef to Fort Smith and the surrounding settlements. He had been working there for 3 years, ever since he had drifted into Arkansas from Texas, looking for honest work and a place to settle down. Do you miss Texas? Nora asked. Sometimes, Griffin admitted, but Arkansas feels like home now. The ranch is a good place and Mrs. Morrison treats her hands fairly. Her son, James, will inherit the place someday and he is a good man. A bit young still, only 20, but he is learning the business well. The ranch, when they reached it, was more impressive than Nora had expected. The main house was a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch, surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided shade from the Arkansas sun. There were several outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and what looked like a workshop. Cattle grazed in the pastures beyond, fat and healthy. Griffin helped Nora down from the horse, then led her up to the main house. A woman emerged onto the porch before they reached it, a tall, sturdy woman in her early 50s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She had shrewd eyes and a firm mouth, but her expression was welcoming rather than harsh. Griffin, she said. I did not expect you back until evening. Who is this? Mrs. Morrison. This is Miss Nora Owens. She had an accident on the river yesterday, lost everything she owned, and is in need of work. I thought she might be a good fit for the household help you have been wanting. Mrs. Morrison's sharp eyes took in Nora's borrowed dress and the fading bruises on her arms. An accident on the river. You are lucky to be alive, girl. The Arkansas has been running high with all the rain. I would not be alive if Griffin had not pulled me out, Nora said. He saved my life. Did he now? Mrs. Morrison looked at Griffin with something like approval. That sounds like him, always helping strays. But there was affection in her voice, not criticism. She turned her attention back to Nora. What kind of work are you used to, Miss Owens? I helped my father with his leather working business, Nora said. I can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. I am not afraid of hard work, Mrs. Morrison, and I need the employment. I would be grateful for the chance to prove myself. Mrs. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I can offer you room in the house, 3 meals a day and $6 a month to start. If you prove yourself capable, I will raise it to $8 after 3 months. You would help with the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, and the garden. It is hard work, Miss Owens, and the days are long. I accept, Nora said immediately. $6 a month was more than she had expected, and room and board besides. It was a lifeline, and she was not fool enough to refuse it. Good. Mrs. Morrison smiled for the first time, transforming her stern face into something almost gentle. Come inside and I will show you your room. You can start tomorrow after you have had a proper rest. Griffin, you can get back to work. I am sure the cattle did not tend themselves while you were playing hero." Griffin grinned, tipped his hat to both women, and headed toward the barn. Nora watched him go, feeling oddly reluctant to see him leave. He had been her constant companion since pulling her from the river, and without him, she felt unmoored. Mrs. Morrison must have noticed her expression because she said, "Griffin is a good man. One of the best hands I have ever had, and that is saying something. He will take good care of that horse and be back for supper. You will see him then." Nora felt her cheeks warm at being so easily rayed, but she followed Mrs. Morrison into the house without comment. The interior was clean and well-maintained, with simple furniture and practical decorations. Mrs. Morrison led her upstairs to a small room at the back of the house, furnished with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a washstand. "This will be yours," Mrs. Morrison said. "It is not much, but it is private, and the window gets a nice breeze in the summer. I will have some clothes sent up for you. You look to be about the same size as my late daughter-in-law." "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison," Nora said, genuinely touched by the older woman's kindness. "I will not disappoint you. See that you do not," Mrs. Morrison said, but there was warmth in her voice. "Rest now. Supper is at 6, and you can meet the rest of the household then." When Mrs. Morrison was gone, Nora sat on the bed and looked around her new room. It was small and plain, but it was hers, at least for now. She had a job, a place to sleep, and 3 meals a day. It was more than she had woken up with that morning, and far more than she had expected to have after losing everything in the river, and she had Griffin Dalton to thank for all of it. Supper that evening was a lively affair. The dining room table was crowded with ranch hands, a dozen men of various ages who ate with the enthusiasm of people who had been working hard all day. Mrs. Morrison presided over the meal with quiet authority, while her son James, a lanky young man with sandy hair and a ready smile, helped serve the food. Griffin sat near the end of the table, and Nora found herself seated across from him. He caught her eye and winked, a gesture that made her smile despite her nervousness at being surrounded by so many strangers. The men were polite to her, a few of them tipping their hats in greeting, but most were too focused on the excellent roast beef and potatoes to pay her much attention. After supper, when the men had dispersed to the bunkhouse or their evening chores, Griffin found Nora on the porch. She was sitting on the steps, looking out at the darkening sky, thinking about how much her life had changed in just 2 days. "May I join you?" Griffin asked. "Of course." Nora scooted over to make room for him on the step. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Cattle lowing in the distance, the soft nicker of horses in the barn, the chirp of crickets in the grass. "Thank you," Nora said finally, "for everything. The rescue, the doctor, the boarding house, this job. You have done more for me than anyone had a right to expect." "You have already thanked me several times," Griffin said with a smile. "You do not need to keep doing it." "But I feel like I do," Nora insisted. "You saved my life, Griffin. That is not something I can just forget or take lightly." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Nora said firmly. "You did what a good man would have done. There is a difference." In the fading light, she saw his cheeks color slightly, and she realized that he was embarrassed by her praise. It made her like him even more, this man who had performed an act of genuine heroism and then brushed it off as though it were nothing. "Well," Griffin said, clearing his throat, "I am glad I was there, and I am glad Mrs. Morrison hired you. It will be nice to have you around." "Will it?" Nora asked, surprised by the boldness in her own voice. "Yes," Griffin said, looking at her directly. "It will." The air between them seemed to shift, to become charged with something Nora could not quite name. She found herself very aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth of his body next to hers, of the way the twilight softened his features and made his gray eyes seem even more striking. "I should get to bed," she said, standing abruptly. "Mrs. Morrison wants me to start work tomorrow, and I need to be well rested." "Of course." Griffin stood as well. "Good night, Nora." "Good night, Griffin." She went inside, her heart beating faster than it should have been, and climbed the stairs to her room. When she looked out the window, she could see Griffin still standing on the porch, looking out at the ranch he called home. She watched him for a moment, then drew the curtains and prepared for bed. Her first days at the Morrison ranch were busy but satisfying. Mrs. Morrison was a fair but exacting employer, and Nora threw herself into the work with determination. She helped prepare meals for the household and the ranch hands, a task that involved cooking for 15 people 3 times a day. She cleaned the main house, scrubbing floors and washing windows and beating rugs. She did laundry, a back-breaking job that left her arms aching and her hands red and raw. She tended the garden, weeding and watering and harvesting vegetables. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done before, but there was satisfaction in it. At the end of each day, she could see the results of her labor. Clean clothes hanging on the line, a spotless kitchen, fresh vegetables for the table. And Mrs. Morrison, though sparing with her praise, seemed pleased with her new employee. Griffin was a constant presence, though he was often out on the range with the other hands, tending cattle or mending fences or performing the 100 other tasks that kept a ranch running. But he always made time to speak with Nora, stopping by the kitchen for a cup of coffee or lingering after supper to talk on the porch. Their conversations ranged from the mundane to the profound, discussing everything from the best way to treat saddle sores to their dreams for the future. Nora found herself looking forward to these conversations more than she cared to admit. Griffin was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor and a thoughtful way of listening that made her feel heard. He told her stories about his life in Texas, about the cattle drives he had been on as a younger man, about the family he had left behind when he struck out on his own. She told him about her father, about growing up on the homestead, about the loneliness of losing the only family she had ever known. "Do you miss him?" Griffin asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set. It had been 3 weeks since Nora started working at the ranch, and she had settled into a comfortable routine. "Every day," Nora admitted. "He was a good man, even if he was not always the easiest person to live with. He had high standards for himself and for me. But he taught me everything he knew, and he never treated me like I was less capable just because I was a woman." "He sounds like someone I would have liked to meet," Griffin said. "He would have liked you," Nora said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "He respected people who worked hard and treated others fairly. You are both of those things." Griffin looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "You are a remarkable woman, Nora Owens," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." "I am just doing what I need to do to survive," Nora said, uncomfortable with the praise even as it warmed her heart. "That is what makes you remarkable," Griffin insisted. "You lost everything, and instead of giving up, you kept going. You found a way forward. That takes strength." Nora wanted to say something, to respond to the sincerity in his voice, but Mrs. Morrison called from inside the house, needing help with something, and the moment passed. But it stayed with her, that moment on the porch, the look in Griffin's eyes and the words he had spoken. She found herself thinking about it as she worked, as she lay in bed at night, as she watched him from the kitchen window as he worked with the horses in the corral. She was falling in love with Griffin Dalton, she realized, with a mixture of joy and terror. It had happened so gradually that she had not even noticed until it was too late, until her heart was already his. She loved the way he smiled at her across the supper table, the way he always asked how her day had been, the way he treated her like an equal rather than a servant. She loved his kindness, his strength, his quiet competence. She loved the sound of his voice and the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, but she had no idea if he felt the same way. He was friendly to her, certainly, but he was friendly to everyone on the ranch. And why would a man like Griffin Dalton, a skilled cowboy with his whole life ahead of him, be interested in a penniless woman who worked as a household servant? She tried to push the feelings away, to focus on her work and her new life at the ranch. But it was impossible to ignore her heart, especially when Griffin seemed to seek out her company more and more. It came to a head one Saturday evening in late May. Most of the ranch hands had ridden into Fort Smith for the evening, planning to spend their wages on whiskey and cards at the saloon. Mrs. Morrison and her son had gone to visit neighbors on a nearby ranch, leaving Nora alone to finish the evening chores. She was washing dishes in the kitchen, humming to herself, when she heard footsteps behind her. "I thought everyone had gone to town," she said, turning to find Griffin standing in the doorway. "I am not much for saloons," he said, "and I thought you might want some company." "I always want your company," Nora said before she could stop herself. Then, horrified by her own boldness, she turned quickly back to the dishes, her face burning. She heard Griffin cross the kitchen, felt him stop beside her at the wash basin. "Nora," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her heart race. "Yes." She did not look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the soapy water. "Look at me, please." She dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him, her pulse pounding in her ears. He was standing very close, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I need to tell you something," Griffin said. "And I hope it does not make things awkward between us, but I cannot keep it to myself any longer." "What is it?" Nora whispered. "I have feelings for you," Griffin said. "I have had them since the day I pulled you out of that river, and they have only grown stronger every day since. I think about you constantly. I look for excuses to be near you. I find myself smiling at the thought of seeing you at supper or hearing your voice from the kitchen. I know you are trying to build a new life for yourself, and I do not want to complicate that, but I need you to know. I am falling in love with you, Nora Owens." Nora stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "You are?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I am," Griffin confirmed. "And if you do not feel the same way, I will respect that. We can continue as friends, and I will never mention it again. But if there is any chance that you might feel the same way, I had to tell you." "Griffin," Nora said, and then she could not find the words. So instead, she closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was a tentative kiss at first, uncertain and questioning, but Griffin responded immediately, his arms coming around her and pulling her close. The kiss deepened, becoming something passionate and profound, and Nora felt like she was drowning again, but this time in the best possible way. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Griffin rested his forehead against hers. "I will take that as a yes," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Yes," Nora said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I feel the same way. I love you, Griffin Dalton. I think I have loved you since you pulled me from that river." He kissed her again, and Nora lost track of time, lost track of everything except the feeling of being in his arms, of being loved and cherished and safe. When they finally pulled apart for good, Griffin kept his arms around her waist, as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. "What do we do now?" he asked. "I suppose we court properly," Nora said, "though it might be difficult living and working at the same ranch." "We will make it work," Griffin said confidently. "And when enough time has passed and if you are willing, I would like to marry you." "Marry me?" Nora's heart leaped at the words. "You want to marry me, more than anything," Griffin said, "but I will not rush you. I know you have been through a lot and I want you to be sure." "I am sure," Nora said. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." They told Mrs. Morrison the next day, and the older woman's stern face broke into a wide smile. "About time," she said. "I have been watching the two of you dance around each other for weeks. You have my blessing, of course." James Morrison clapped Griffin on the back and congratulated them both, and the ranch hands toasted their happiness at supper that evening. It felt real then, official, and Nora found herself grinning like a fool as Griffin held her hand under the table. They courted properly for the next 4 months, though it was sometimes torture to be so close to each other and yet maintain propriety. Griffin took Nora into Fort Smith on Saturdays, buying her small gifts and treating her to dinner at the hotel restaurant. They went on long rides around the ranch property, talking and laughing and stealing kisses when they were sure no one was watching. They made plans for their future, for the life they would build together. Griffin wanted to save enough money to buy his own piece of land someday, a small ranch where he could raise cattle and horses. Nora wanted to set up a leather working shop to carry on her father's legacy in her own way. They dreamed about a house with a porch and a garden, about children running through the fields, about growing old together. In September of 1878, they were married in Fort Smith by the local minister, with Mrs. Morrison, James, and most of the ranch hands in attendance. Nora wore a dress that Mrs. Morrison had helped her sew, a simple but elegant gown of pale blue cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Griffin wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous as he waited for her at the altar. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Griffin kissed her with such tenderness that Nora felt tears spring to her eyes. This man, who had saved her life and then given her a new one, was now her husband. It felt like a miracle. Mrs. Morrison had given them the weekend off as a wedding present, and they spent it at the boarding house in Fort Smith, finally alone together as husband and wife. It was everything Nora had hoped for and more, being with Griffin without restraint, learning each other's bodies and hearts with a freedom they had never had before. "I love you," Griffin whispered to her in the darkness of their room, his hand gentle on her face. "I will love you for the rest of my life." "And I will love you," Nora promised. "Always." When they returned to the Morrison Ranch on Monday, they moved into one of the small cabins on the property that Mrs. Morrison used for married hands. It was just 2 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen and a bedroom, but it was theirs, and Nora set about making it a home. She hung curtains, arranged the furniture, and planted flowers outside the door. Griffin built her a workbench in the corner of the main room, and Nora began saving her wages to buy leather-working tools. Life settled into a new rhythm. Nora continued to help Mrs. Morrison with the household work, but now she had her own home to care for as well. Griffin continued his work on the ranch, but now he came home to a wife who loved him, to a warm meal and a welcoming embrace. They were happy, genuinely and completely happy, and Nora thanked God every day for the river that had brought them together. In the spring of 1879, Nora discovered she was pregnant. She told Griffin one evening after supper, as they sat together on the porch of their little cabin, watching the sun set over the pastures. "I am going to have a baby," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. Griffin's eyes went wide, and then a smile spread across his face so wide it looked like it might split him in two. "A baby," he repeated. "We are going to have a baby, we are," Nora confirmed, laughing at his expression. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she were made of glass. "I am going to be a father," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Nora asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Griffin said. "I am overjoyed. I am thrilled. I am the luckiest man in Arkansas." Mrs. Morrison was delighted by the news and immediately began knitting baby clothes and planning for the birth. James built a cradle in the workshop, a beautiful piece made from oak and polished to a high shine. The ranch hands congratulated Griffin with backslaps and teasing comments about sleepless nights and dirty diapers. As Nora's belly grew, so did her dreams for the future. She imagined teaching their child the leather-working trade, just as her father had taught her. She imagined Griffin teaching their son or daughter to ride, to care for horses, to love the land as he did. She imagined a house full of children, laughter echoing through the rooms, a family built on love and mutual respect. In November of 1879, Nora went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, and there were moments when Nora thought she might not survive it. But Dr. Morris was there, and Mrs. Morrison, and most importantly, Griffin, who held her hand and whispered encouragement even when she was too exhausted to respond. Finally, after nearly 20 hours of labor, Nora gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Griffin wept when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny, perfect human they had created. "What should we name him?" Nora asked, tired but happy as she watched her husband cradle their child. "What about Samuel?" Griffin suggested. "After Dr. Morris, who helped bring him into the world." "Samuel Dalton," Nora said, testing the name. "I like it. Samuel it is." Little Samuel was a good baby, healthy and strong with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. He grew quickly, reaching for everything within sight, smiling toothless grins that melted Nora's heart. Griffin was a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son, singing to him and telling him stories, and making him laugh with funny faces. When Samuel was 6 months old, Nora finally had saved enough money to buy a basic set of leather-working tools. She set up her little workshop in the corner of the cabin and began creating small pieces: belts, pouches, bookmarks. Mrs. Morrison took some of her work to sell in Fort Smith, and to Nora's delight, people bought them. Word spread about the quality of her craftsmanship, and soon she was receiving orders from people she had never met. By the time Samuel was 2 years old, Nora's leather-working business had grown enough that she was able to contribute significantly to the family's savings. Griffin had been promoted to foreman of the Morrison Ranch, a position that came with a higher salary and more responsibility. They were building the life they had dreamed about, slowly but surely. In 1882, Nora gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace. She had Griffin's smile and Nora's determination, and from the moment she could crawl, she followed her older brother everywhere. Samuel adored his little sister, patient and protective, even though he was only 3 years old. Mrs. Morrison doted on both children, treating them like the grandchildren she had never had. James Morrison married a woman from Fort Smith, a sweet-natured girl named Rebecca, and they had children of their own soon after. The Morrison Ranch became a place full of children's laughter, of families building lives together. In 1884, Griffin came home one evening with news that changed everything. "I talked to Henry Parker today," he said, referring to a neighboring rancher. "He is getting old and wants to sell his property. 50 acres with a stream running through it, good grazing land, and a small house that needs work." Nora looked up from her sewing. "How much is he asking?" $300, Griffin said. I know it is a lot, but we have almost 200 saved up. If we can borrow the rest from Mrs. Morrison and pay her back over time, we could do it. We could have our own place, Nora. Our own ranch. Their own ranch. It was everything they had been working toward, everything they had dreamed about. Let us talk to Mrs. Morrison, Nora said. Mrs. Morrison agreed to lend them the money without hesitation. You two have worked hard for this, she said. You deserve a place of your own, and you will still be neighbors, close enough to visit regularly. In the fall of 1884, the Dalton family moved to their own property. The house was small and needed repairs, but Griffin worked on it in his spare time, and Nora helped whenever she could. They built a barn for their small herd of cattle, a shed for Nora's leather working business, and a workshop for Griffin's various projects. Samuel, now 5 years old, loved having space to run and explore. Grace, at 2, toddled after him, determined to keep up with her older brother. They were happy children, full of energy and curiosity, and Nora could not imagine loving anyone more except for Griffin. Their ranch was modest compared to the Morrison spread, but it was theirs. Griffin built their herd slowly, buying cattle at good prices and breeding them carefully. Nora's leather working business continued to grow, and she even began teaching Samuel some of the basic techniques. He showed promise, though his real passion seemed to be for the horses that Griffin was beginning to raise and train. Years passed in a blur of hard work and happy moments. In 1887, Nora gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas. He was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with solemn eyes, so different from his boisterous older siblings. In 1890, their fourth child arrived, a daughter they named Rose. She had red gold hair, a surprise since neither Griffin nor Nora had red in their families, but she was beautiful and spirited, and they loved her immediately. The Dalton ranch prospered. Griffin proved to be a skilled rancher, and their herd grew to nearly 100 head. Nora's leather work was now in demand throughout the territory, and she had even received orders from as far away as Little Rock. They built an addition onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms to accommodate their growing family. Samuel grew into a tall, capable young man who could handle any horse on the ranch. Grace became her mother's apprentice in the leather working business, showing a natural talent for the intricate stitching and tooling. Thomas preferred reading to ranching, and they encouraged his love of books, even though it set him apart from his more physical siblings. Rose was the adventurer, always climbing trees and chasing after the ranch hands, determined to prove she could do anything her brothers could do. In 1895, tragedy struck when Mrs. Morrison passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. Nora and Griffin attended the funeral with all 4 of their children, mourning the woman who had given them their start and treated them like family. James Morrison inherited the ranch, and he proved to be just as fair and capable as his mother had been. As the century drew to a close, Griffin and Nora found themselves in their 40s, still deeply in love, still working side by side to build their life. Samuel had fallen in love with a girl from Fort Smith, a banker's daughter named Elizabeth, and they planned to marry in the spring of 1899. Grace had caught the eye of one of the Morrison ranch hands, a steady young man named David who treated her with respect and adoration. One evening in early 1899, Griffin and Nora sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the land they had built together. Their children's voices drifted from inside, where they were preparing supper and arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to do the dishes. "Do you ever think about that day?" Griffin asked. "The day I pulled you out of the river, all the time," Nora admitted. "I think about how close I came to dying and how different my life might have been if you had not been there." "I think about it too," Griffin said. "And I thank God every day that I was riding that road at that exact moment, that I was close enough to reach you, that I had a rope with me. So many things had to align perfectly for us to be here now." "Do you believe in fate?" Nora asked. "I did not used to," Griffin said. "But meeting you made me reconsider. Maybe some things are meant to be." Nora leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I am glad I nearly drowned in that river," she said. "Is that a terrible thing to say?" "No," Griffin said, his arm coming around her. "Because if you had not, I would never have met you. I would never have known what it is like to truly love someone, to build a life with them, to watch them become a mother and a businesswoman and the strongest person I know." "You saved me," Nora said. "In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Griffin corrected. "You gave me a purpose, a family, a reason to build something permanent instead of just drifting from place to place. You made me want to be better, to be worthy of you." "You have always been worthy," Nora said firmly, "from the moment you threw that rope." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Inside the house, someone laughed, and someone else started playing the piano that Nora had bought last year with the profits from her business. "We have had a good life," Griffin said. "A really good life." "We have," Nora agreed, "and it is not over yet." Samuel married Elizabeth in the spring, and the wedding was held at the Dalton Ranch. The whole community turned out for the celebration, and Nora found herself tearing up as she watched her oldest son pledge his life to the woman he loved. It reminded her of her own wedding, of standing beside Griffin and promising to love him forever, a promise she had kept every single day since. Grace married David that summer, and they decided to stay on the Dalton Ranch, building a small house on the property where they could raise their own family. Thomas announced his intention to attend university in Little Rock, a decision that surprised no one who knew him and his love of learning. Rose, at 9 years old, declared that she would never marry and would instead become a cowgirl, a statement that made everyone laugh but which Nora secretly thought she might actually achieve. In 1901, Samuel and Elizabeth presented Griffin and Nora with their first grandchild, a boy they named Griffin after his grandfather. Griffin wept when he held the baby, just as he had wept when holding his own children, and Nora fell in love all over again watching her husband with their grandson. Grace and David had twin daughters in 1902, and suddenly the Dalton Ranch was full of grandchildren, their laughter and energy making the place feel even more alive. Thomas came home from university on holidays with stories about his studies and the world beyond Arkansas. Rose, at 12, was indeed becoming quite the horsewoman, able to outride most of the ranch hands. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges but also joy and love. The Dalton Ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful small operations in the area. Nora's leather goods were now sold in shops throughout Arkansas and into neighboring states. Griffin's horses were prized for their intelligence and temperament, and he had buyers coming from hundreds of miles away. But more than their professional success, it was their family that brought them the greatest happiness. Their children grew into capable, loving adults who raised families of their own. Their grandchildren brought laughter and chaos in equal measure. And through it all, Griffin and Nora remained devoted to each other, their love deepening with each passing year. In 1910, they celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary with a party attended by dozens of family members and friends. Samuel gave a toast, thanking his parents for the example they had set, for showing their children what a true partnership looked like. Grace read a poem she had written about love and family. Thomas presented them with a leather-bound book he had made himself, filled with family stories and photographs. Rose, now a young woman of 20 who had indeed never married but ran a successful horse training operation, simply hugged them both fiercely and told them she loved them. As the party wound down and the guests departed, Griffin and Nora found themselves alone on the porch once again, their favorite spot for over 30 years. They were both in their 50s now, their hair touched with gray, their hands weathered from years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been when they first met, when Griffin had pulled Nora from a wild river and changed both their lives forever. "I would do it all again," Griffin said suddenly. "Every moment, every hardship, every joy. I would do it all again just to be with you." "As would I," Nora said, taking his hand. "I used to think that almost drowning in that river was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but it was actually the best thing because it brought me to you." "To us," Griffin corrected, gesturing to the ranch around them, to the life they had built. "To us," Nora agreed. They kissed as the stars came out overhead, the same stars that had watched over them for more than 3 decades. They had built something beautiful together, something that would last long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren would carry on the Dalton name, would tell stories about the cowboy who saved a drowning woman and fell in love with her, would live lives shaped by the love and values that Griffin and Nora had instilled in them. In 1915, they celebrated their 50th birthdays, Griffin turning 57 and Nora turning 59. The entire family gathered at the ranch for a week-long celebration. There were now 15 grandchildren ranging from newborn to 14 years old, and 3 great-grandchildren, the oldest being Samuel and Elizabeth's grandson. The house was bursting with people and noise and love. On the last evening of the celebration, after the younger children had been put to bed, and the older ones had wandered off to their own conversations, the adult children gathered with Griffin and Nora in the living room. Samuel, now a successful rancher himself at 36, spoke first. "We wanted to thank you," he said, looking at his parents, "for everything you have given us. For this ranch, yes, but more importantly, for the example you have set. You taught us what it means to work hard, to treat people fairly, to build something lasting. You taught us what real love looks like. You showed us that where you start does not determine where you end up," Grace added, now 33 and a master leather worker in her own right. "Mother, you lost everything in that river, and instead of giving up, you rebuilt. You created a business and a life that has provided for all of us. You taught me that a woman can be strong and capable and successful. You taught me that education matters, but so does family," Thomas said. The 29-year-old was now a teacher himself, having returned to Fort Smith to run the school. "You supported my choice to pursue learning even though it took me away from the ranch. You never made me feel less than because I preferred books to cattle. And you taught me that I did not have to fit into anyone's expectations," Rose said. At 25, she was running one of the most respected horse training operations in Arkansas, still unmarried and fiercely independent. "You let me be who I was meant to be, even when it was unconventional." Nora was crying openly by this point, and Griffin's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We just loved you," Nora said. "That was all we ever tried to do, love you and give you the tools to build good lives." "You did more than that," Samuel said. "You gave us a legacy. A name we are proud to carry, a family we are grateful to be part of, and a model for how to live a good life." Griffin cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Your mother and I have been blessed beyond measure," he said. "We started with nothing but love and determination, and look at what we built. Look at all of you. You are our greatest achievement, and we could not be more proud." As the evening wore on, and the family gradually dispersed to their various beds and rooms, Griffin and Nora remained in the living room, holding hands and marveling at the life they had created together. "You remember what you said to me that first night, after you pulled me from the river?" Nora asked. "I said a lot of things," Griffin replied with a smile. "You said I was alive, and that was what mattered," Nora reminded him. "And you were right. Being alive was what mattered. But being alive with you, building this life with you, loving you and being loved by you, that is what made it all worthwhile." "I love you, Nora Dalton," Griffin said, just as he had said countless times over the past 37 years. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Nora replied, "forever and always." The years continued to pass, bringing more grandchildren and great-grandchildren, more celebrations and milestones. In 1920, Griffin and Nora celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary, surrounded by a family that had grown to include more than 30 direct descendants. They were both in their 60s now, slowing down but still active, still engaged with the ranch and the business and the family that meant everything to them. In the spring of 1925, Griffin fell ill with pneumonia. Dr. Morris's son, who had taken over his father's practice, did everything he could, but Griffin's lungs had been weakened by years of breathing in dust and smoke from the ranch work. He lingered for 2 weeks, surrounded by his family, before passing peacefully in his sleep with Nora holding his hand. Nora was devastated by the loss. For 47 years, Griffin had been her partner, her love, her best friend. The house felt empty without him, the ranch hollow despite the presence of her children and grandchildren. She went through the motions of living, but a part of her had died with Griffin. But as the months passed, she found comfort in the legacy they had built together. Every time she looked at her children, she saw Griffin in their faces, in their gestures, in the values they held dear. Every time she held a great-grandchild, she felt Griffin's presence, his love living on through the generations they had created. Every time she worked with leather, creating beautiful pieces with her aged but still skilled hands, she felt connected to both her father and her husband, carrying on traditions and passing them down. On what would have been their 48th wedding anniversary, Nora stood on the porch of the ranch house, looking out at the land that she and Griffin had built together. Samuel came out to join her, his own hair now touched with gray, his face lined from years in the sun. "Are you all right, Mother?" he asked. "I miss him," Nora said simply. "Every single day I miss him." "We all do," Samuel said, "but he is still here in a way, in this ranch, in all of us, in the life he built with you." "I know," Nora said, "and I am grateful for every moment we had together. I just wish we could have had more." "He saved your life," Samuel said, "and in doing so, he gave life to all of us. We exist because he was riding by that river on that particular day, because he had the courage and skill to pull you to safety, because he fell in love with you and you with him. That is a remarkable thing." Nora smiled through her tears. "It is not it? We had a great love story, your father and I, the kind people write about in books." "You should write it down," Samuel suggested. "Your story, how you met, how you built this life together. Future generations should know." And so Nora began to write, spending her evenings putting their story down on paper. She wrote about the river and the rescue, about their courtship and marriage, about building the ranch and raising their family. She wrote about the challenges they had faced and overcome, about the love that had sustained them through everything. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes grew tired, driven by the need to preserve their story, to ensure that Griffin's memory and their love would live on. She completed the manuscript in the spring of 1926, nearly a year after Griffin's death. She had copies made and gave one to each of her children, asking them to share it with their own children and grandchildren. It was her gift to them, the story of where they had come from, of the love that had made their family possible. Nora lived for another 5 years after Griffin's death, remaining active and engaged with her family and her business until the very end. She continued to create beautiful leather work, teaching her skills to any grandchild or great-grandchild who showed interest. She attended weddings and christenings, birthday parties and holidays, always the matriarch of the growing Dalton clan. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1930 at the age of 74. She was buried next to Griffin on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, under a simple headstone that read, "Nora Dalton, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, together again." At her funeral, which was attended by more than 100 family members and friends, Samuel read from the story she had written, the tale of a woman who had nearly drowned in a wild river and the cowboy who had saved her, setting in motion a love story that had spanned nearly half a century and touched countless lives. "They taught us that true love endures," Samuel said, his voice breaking slightly. "That from tragedy can come joy, that with determination and love anything is possible. They started with nothing but each other, and they built an empire of the heart. We are all here because of their love, and we will carry that love forward into future generations." The Dalton Ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management, and later his children's. Nora's leather working business was carried on by Grace and her daughters, maintaining the high standards and exceptional craftsmanship that Nora had been known for. Thomas's children became teachers and scholars, spreading knowledge and learning throughout Arkansas. Rose's horse training operation became legendary, her methods studied and copied by trainers across the country. And through it all, the story of Griffin and Nora lived on, passed down through generations, embellished perhaps but never losing its essential truth. That on an April morning in 1878, a cowboy had lassoed a drowning woman and pulled her ashore, and in doing so had set in motion a love story for the ages. Their descendants multiplied and spread across the country, but they all knew their history, knew the story of the cowboy and the woman he saved, knew that they existed because of a split-second decision made on the banks of the Arkansas River. In 1978, on the 100th anniversary of that fateful day, the Dalton family held a reunion at the ranch, which was still in the family and still operating. More than 200 descendants of Griffin and Nora attended, representing 5 generations. They gathered on the banks of the Arkansas River, at a spot as close as they could get to where the rescue had taken place, and they commemorated the moment that had started it all. The oldest attendee was Samuel and Elizabeth's daughter, now 82 years old, who had known her grandmother Nora well, and had heard the story directly from her lips countless times. She stood before the assembled family and told the story again, her voice strong despite her age, making sure that the youngest generation understood where they had come from. They were ordinary people, she concluded. A woman trying to make her way in the world after losing everything, and a cowboy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But their love was extraordinary. It sustained them through hardship and joy, through loss and celebration, through all the ups and downs of nearly 5 decades together. And that love created all of this, created all of us. We are their legacy, and we have a responsibility to honor them by living lives of love, integrity, and purpose, just as they did. The family placed a marker on the riverbank that day, a simple stone plaque that read, "On this spot in April 1878, Griffin Dalton saved Nora Owens from drowning, beginning a love story that created a family. May we always remember their courage, their love, and their legacy. And as the sun set over the Arkansas River, the Dalton family gathered together, connected by blood and by the love of two people who had met in the most dramatic way possible and had built something beautiful from that chance encounter. The river flowed on, as it always had and always would, carrying water and sediment and memories toward the distant sea, while on its banks, the family that Griffin and Nora had created celebrated their love and the enduring power of a split-second decision made with courage and a rope.